This is an ordinance to delete Chapter 115, Article 17, the Vacation Retirement Residential Park District, Sections 115, 132 through 115, 140 in its entirety, and to insert Article 17 Master Plan Zone, Sections 115, 132 through 115, 140 in its place. Submitted into the record, Mr Chairman, we have a copy of the ordinance as it was introduced into Council earlier this year. We also have a copy of the Plus response from the Plus meeting that was held back in February of this year, and those comments are dated March 22nd. We also have received one comment letter. This letter was received today, Mr Chairman, so you may not have seen this yet. We can get copies to you. And then in summary, because this is a somewhat technical ordinance, Mr Robertson's I'm going to yield to Mr Robertson so he can present.
Sure, thanks. I was not look around. I know how to clear a room out. I just got Mr. here. Yikes. Oh, that's not a bad thing, though, either. If I could convince Mr. Hutt to leave, I'd be in really good shape. No. So this one, just for the benefit of everybody, this has been something that's been in the works for quite some time. It really goes back to our 2018 comprehensive plan, where we wanted to look at a way that's not currently in our code to let folks that have larger parcels that may be developed have more creativity and also give some flexibility not only to the developer but also the county, so we don't get the same looking subdivisions, for example, all the time. And we also wanted to create a way that we could create larger sort of mixed-use developments that incorporate commercial uses, institutional uses, mixed-use residential, as well as interconnectivity on a fairly large scale with greater density than you could get, currently under the base zone. Package it all into one zoning application, deal with it sort of at a high level when it goes through the public hearing process, and then let the Planning and Zoning Commission deal with sort of more the site plan review stage on the back end without public hearings, and then staff review for the more nitty-gritty details of it. You may have heard me tell you this before. We kind of looked around for a model to use because this is fairly complex, and actually City of Dover has a master plan ordinance. And so we kind of took that, deconstructed that, and then reconstructed it so that it would hopefully work in Sussex County. I think I touched on a few of the items up here on the screen already. The third item, third bullet, it's not intended to replace RPCs, subdivisions, or more typical types of commercial development. That was one of the comments that we received in the correspondence today, that why don't we just, do away with this and keep the RPCs and maybe beef those up. My initial thought to that was, well, why shouldn't we create an additional tool in the toolbox for people to use? And the difference between this and an RPC, this is on a bigger scale, as it says in the other bullet. It's 200 acres or more. So, we're not talking about smaller projects. If you have a smaller project, you could still do an RPC or a subdivision or change zone or conditional use. It also does allow you to go to a larger density at a potentially 12 units an acre. There is some governors on that, but again, it also allows more intensive commercial or institutional uses than an RPC would be able to use. Because for those of you who don't recall, an RPC, you can do commercial, but it's limited. It's really limited on how much you can do. So again, it's intended to incorporate the following areas as part of a single unified development: the residential areas, what's called neighborhood commercial, what's called professional, medical, and financial office areas, and also civic areas. The idea is you don't have to use all of those, but you have to use some of those. In other words, this isn't supposed to be an opportunity to just do a giant residential subdivision at 12 units an acre. If you're going to give us residential, we need some commercial and either civic areas or professional office areas in there as well. One of the things we looked at is it's large scale enough to promote interconnectivity. That's been an interesting conversation of late. But this is big enough where if you think of it as being 200 acres between, say, two state-maintained roads, the idea would be that you would install a state-maintained road down the middle to provide interconnectivity between those roads, but also within that development. And then the roadways that sort of spur off from that would be private but dedicated to public use. I did want to touch upon that's not in the site plan, the requirements, just so you know what the threshold requirements are. 200 acres is the minimum. This is on page 7 of the ordinance, line 204. 20% of the land area must be designated to a non-residential use. The density can exceed 12 units an acre. The land area shall have access to an existing or planned arterial or collector road, and those are defined terms. The land area shall be served by existing or planned infrastructure such as sewer and water. The proposed MPZ must be generally consistent with the comprehensive plan. And then one thing we added, because we wanted to put this in here, at least for the conversation of it, is at least if you're going to do this, 20% of all the multifamily dwellings shall be set aside as Sussex County's rental unit dwellings. So that in return for the design flexibility that an applicant gets, the county is getting something in return, which would be more rental units under its affordable rental program. There's also open space requirements that are included in it as well. So there's definitions. It's not wide open. There's sort of guardrails that you have to stay within, and then you're given design flexibility. So the process is a 4-step process, and each level sort of defines what you need to do. The first one is, let me go back. The pre-application meeting, and that's what happens now, I think, with larger developments where the applicant and engineering staff and maybe the attorney would meet with planning and zoning staff and our county engineer to go over the development, make sure there's not any pitfalls in it, and also suggest some design changes that may be appropriate from either an engineering standpoint or a land use standpoint. And that's when plus review happens as well. The next is the public hearing, just like we'd have now on a rezoning before planning and zoning and county council. And on this one, a little bit different from what you're used to seeing even on an RPC. There's not a super detailed site plan that's provided. Instead, there's a general overall master plan that's submitted, and that sort of just defines this is what we want this to look like. I think more important is the spatial distribution plan, and there's examples of that coming up, which show where your density is going. Like, so this sort of area is going to be, for example, around the outside of it, the lower density. You know, and as you go towards the middle, maybe 4 units an acre, 6 units an acre, and possibly 12 in the middle, and then also where your commercial uses or neighborhood commercial is going to be, or the civic areas or whatever. Just to give you sort of an idea of, like a bubble drawing, or if you think of like a topographical map, but instead of elevations, it's density, you know, just to give you an idea, the county an idea of what the density will be. And then with that, there's a master manual submitted, which is the design guidelines that a developer, you know, after meeting with the county, gets to come in and say, these are the design guidelines that we're going to utilize in this master plan. And I'm not going to go through all those, but there's about 14 different elements that they need to show in that master manual. And that master manual then governs this whole thing from beginning to end. So everything has to be consistent with that going forward. And again, this will be public hearings advertised just like a change of zone with all the newspaper ads and public notices and everything else. And like we do now, that's a hearing before you all with a recommendation to county council. The next step is the administrative review of the plans. That's a little misleading. It's not actually administrative. I mean, it is to some degree, but it's the Planning and Zoning Commission that reviews those, kind of like what we do with site plans now. And so at this stage, there's an implementation plan and an implementation manual that's provided. That's much more detail in the area that they're looking to get approved. It has to be consistent with those master manuals and design plans that were provided during the public hearings. And that's going to be vetted by staff. I should say at any point there's a material change, which is defined in here, that would kick it back to the public hearing process. So you can't get the public hearing and then on the back end change it up completely without going back through the public hearings. We want this to stay consistent, sort of general at the top, and then it gets more specific as it goes down. And this is where, you know, it shows the type of housing, the location of the housing, you know, the topography, the streets, roads, sidewalks, and landscaping, the types of thing that you would see on a site plan.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
question, because I don't want to get too far away from this where we go back to it. In the previous slide where we had the manual and the spatial distribution plan and all those things, are the manual, is the contents of the manual something that is proffered by the applicant and approved by the staff, or is it negotiated with the staff, or is it something that is approved by this body? How does that stuff get to be?
So it's something that's, I would say it's yes to all that. So the idea is that for example, that master manual, that's going to be something that the developer, the applicant, is going to initially prepare, probably in draft form. And it's designed to be narrative and graphic form. It's almost like a zoning code that governs this project, if you kind of think of it that way. This is what we're going to do. These are the rules we're going to follow going forward in this project. So there's going to be conversation, and I don't know if negotiation is the right word, maybe, at the initial level, the pre-application meeting. Then they're going to present it to you, and if there's anything that you don't like or county council doesn't like, you have the opportunity to change that, because this is the kind of thing like an RPC that you can put conditions on, so you can deny it outright if you didn't like it.
So there's like a public hearing at that level? Okay, okay. That's what I was getting at. Okay, so there's a public hearing at that level, and then after that, when this starts happening.
Yeah, after all of that happens.
Okay.
So if you think about it, if you kind of try to pigeonhole on what we do now, if you think of the master manual and the general overall master plan as like a zoning code for this project, right? That's approved at the public hearing stage. And then when it comes back for the plan reviews, administrative plan reviews, you're looking to see if those plans and the implementation of that complies with that zoning code that you've established at the public hearing, if that sort of makes sense.
Okay, so if the master plan goes to a public hearing at that previous stage and it is approved, then what will the process be for approving these items? Will they be like a site plan approval is now?
Like site plan approval. That's
okay,
right.
so there's one public hearing that for the entire master plan notion, concept, whatever. And then if that gets approved, from that point forward, it's, I hesitate to use the word administrative, but it's administrative in nature, that it becomes a individual site plan, more of the way we do a site plan. Right. Okay.
And that sort of brings up a good point that I sort of skipped over, with sort of the purpose of this. If you think about, if we didn't have the master plan zone, and you want to think of like, I'll just use Bayside as an example, because if they had done that from day one, they might have used this tool if we had it in place. Or think of it in other ways that we've seen. Right now, if you wanted to do a shopping center with residential and mixed uses and maybe doctor's offices, you'd have to come in and apply for the commercial rezoning. You have a public hearing on that at both council and and at each opportunity, the public's involved, and then you'd have to come in for the RPC or the subdivision, public hearings, public involvement, separate sort of balkanized site plan with not necessarily any interconnectivity. This sort of takes care of that all globally. So it's a one-shot thing. This is what we're doing on this big piece of land. That's the public hearing stage, and then site plans after that.
This is what the public has said to us multiple times, is that we don't have an overview.
Right.
So that certainly will provide that. That will give us a tool to use for that purpose.
Right, and that's kind of the goal, and we've seen that from time to time, and I don't want to name any examples, but where you just see these little smaller parcels all being bitten off for one reason or another, when everybody hopes or knows that it's actually part of a larger plan. This gives a framework to have flexibility and do the larger plan, and get interconnectivity and state roads involved and everything else. So
Speaking of the roads, would the developer initially fund the eventually supported by DelDOT road, or is that required in?
Yeah, no. So it's going to depend, for one thing, on whether it's in a TID or not. So there's, that comes at that early stage, that pre-application meeting. But yeah, there's going to be coordination with DelDOT and the applicant, because we're not looking again for the whole thing to be state roads, but if there's main roads, frankly, that may be a way to kill two birds with one stone. If DelDOT has, interconnectivity on its horizon through its CTP, then there can be, sort of a nexus between the developer and the development and DelDOT to get that done. So, maybe with TID funds if it's in the TID as well. So there's not one answer to that, but, that would be something that would be taken into account. And then the final step, administratively, and truly administratively, is just, we kind of mixed up the terms a little bit, but this is the final site plan, the technical detail site plan. That's a staff review, because you all have already approved generally what the site plan looks like. This is just, the technical details. So, and that would be county engineering and planning and zoning. Keep in mind, throughout this process, it still's got to go through PLUS. It's still got to go through all the agency reviews and everything else. That would come after the public hearings. And just like everything else, it's valid for a period of 5 years to get underway once those site plans are approved. This just gives you an idea of what that spatial distribution plan would look like. Again, this is just really high level to give the commission and the public an idea of, sort of what we're thinking, where, it talks about what the densities are and how many units there are throughout the project, so that the public and the county can be assured that the design makes sense, because generally good planning is that, you have the lower densities to the outside of towards the perimeter of the project, with the higher densities and more intensive uses on the interior, unless it's on, a major arterial roadway or a roadway that could handle the commercial uses, and there's a proposed change I have for that. But that kind of gives you the idea of what we're looking for, so that you know generally what the project's going to look like, and through those manuals will have more detail about each of those sort of areas. And this just zooms in, so it's the same thing for the next couple slides. So you can just sort of see what we're talking about. Because one of the things, for example, now it's really tough to do mixed use anywhere in Sussex County without coming in for a conditional use, where that might be residential over retail, for example. This would enable you to do that, as shown. Shows you some of the commercial areas and the
So can I
type
just
of
ask a
information.
question? So if we get that in and that is approved, then they need to stick with what?
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
They can't, they can't,
Yeah.
So going back, if that's what's approved, and then they come in and say, well, we're going to flip this whole thing, that would trigger a whole new public hearing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know. For example, like if they flipped, like this and this, that might not. But if it's a material change, it would.
So like moving where the grocery store
Yeah.
might be located
Yeah.
on the plan, as long as it's still in the commercial area, probably doesn't.
Right, or this one doesn't really show it as a good example, but if there's a spine road that's, dedicated to the state and state maintained, if that was to be moved, that's the kind of thing that would trigger a new public hearing.
Okay, good.
So, and this just shows sort of that kind of information. This is just a sample one. I don't even think it's based on a real property, right, Jamie? Okay. So you can just get a kind of an idea. So, as part of this process, we went through and met, we've been talking about this at council for, I think, 2 years now, I feel like, because you can see it's a fairly hefty ordinance, and we've talked about it here at the commission for a while. We've gotten some input even before the public hearing as to, I think it was constructive comments we got from some folks, and we actually had some meetings with people that would implement this, and they had some constructive comments. If it's okay with you, I'd like to read these into the record, because there may be things that are recommendation to county council. So the first one is eligibility requirements. There's some confusion as to where this could go. It was referenced in the whereas clause, but we'd like to add it into the ordinance, and that would be to add that it's clearly in the coastal area, the developing area, town center, and commercial area, again, to mirror that whereas clause. At line 192, regarding that spatial distribution plan, we'd like to clarify that in addition to higher densities, the commercial areas or intensive uses should be centrally located and or along main roadways consistent with higher density residential uses. There's a question about whether it had to be in the middle or if you're on, say Route 1, it would make sense to have commercial on Route 1. We didn't want to limit it to where you could put it. Line 209 is eligibility requirements. Consider changing the reference from existing or planned arterial or collector roads, which actually that was a term that was used, but it's not one that's defined in the code, to use major arterial roadways and collector streets, which are actually defined in Chapter 99. Line 223 was the design and development principles and standards, and there was a suggestion to consider adding a new number 11, stating that all collector roads, or the similar term, within the MPZ must be constructed to DelDOT standards and state maintained, or simply move and copy this requirement from elsewhere at line 317 to 322. So that all other, and then state that all other public roads within the MPZ are dedicated to public use and must remain open and accessible to the public at all times. Again, this is large enough with enough different types of uses, including people that would be coming from outside into the commercial or civic or professional uses. We want to make sure that they're all dedicated to public use. There's a requirement in there, was a planning requirement originally that said that all open space shall be located to the fronts of buildings. After meeting with different people and talking over with staff, we said, well, that should be a goal, not a requirement, so we changed that one from shall to should. Service alleys, line 279 to 283. After some talk, there was deleting the reference to those service alleys, the requirement for those, or to require it only in the case of neighborhood commercial areas, professional office, medical or financial areas, or the civic areas. In other words, don't force people to have the service alleys around residential. You could use them if you wanted to. The thought was, if you had service alleys, then the trash and everything else would be in the back. But in talking with different folks that have to design this, that would be a good opportunity, but it would be tough if it's a requirement, given the geometry of things, et cetera. Line 304, and this actually repeats throughout 352 and 386, considering allowing these areas to have frontage on existing DelDOT rights-of-way instead of just an internal main street. This is the one, like if you're on Route 1, you ought to be able to do these more intensive uses on Route 1 and not just the internal street. Line 304 and then also 358 and 392. This is one, it had to do with the parking design, and there's a suggestion in there that it be more flexible and that it be designed so that off-street parking is screened from rights-of-ways and non-commercial uses so that the buildings and landscape areas are more visible than large off-street parking lots. There was previously a requirement that they just not be visible at all or not located in the fronts of buildings. And again, for geometrical reasons and other planning reasons, that may not always be the best, but try to design them so they're at least screened. Again, this is another one, line 317, in terms of changing shall to should about the location of commercial areas and how they're oriented to main streets. And then line 330, 364, and 398. This is kind of like the alleys. Consider deleting this item that service drives shall be designed and used for loading and trash collection, or change it to something like whenever possible, service drives shall be designated or designed and utilized for loading and trash collection. Don't worry, there's only a few more of these. Line 336 to 339, there was a prohibition against drive-through uses in the neighborhood commercial area. That started in there, and I will tell you the reason it started is because we wanted these locations to be more walkable. We wanted to get people to park their cars and try to walk around. I think that still should be a goal, but we also heard that, that gets a little more dicey when you think about it in terms of pharmacies. If there's going to be a pharmacy that's a neighborhood pharmacy, they always want drive-throughs, or banks, not to mention Starbucks. So, but anyway, that was one that it wasn't one that we're going to fall on our sword on, but there was good reasons for taking that out also. And the master manual at line 448, it referred to a master transportation plan approved by DelDOT, which is actually in Dover's model. But we recognize that turns out isn't an item recognized by DelDOT, so we just suggested replace it with traffic impact study for the MPC. The MPZ is approved by DelDOT. Line 466 to 471, again, there was a requirement in the master manual that there be reference to architectural details. Again, that was in the initial draft for discussion purposes. There was conversation about taking that out. For one thing, Sussex County doesn't really dictate architectural styles. The other thing is this is a large enough project that would last over such a long period of time that architectural tastes and styles might change from the time it comes to a public hearing to the time it's built. So that's one to delete. Same thing with line 489 to 491. There was, and this was a Dover one, but design of lighting fixtures and globes, street lighting, that sort of thing, and signage and stuff. That's something that is not so specific that we need to consider at a county level. And then the last item, you'll be glad to hear, is that we just add confirmation that any MPZ will be subject to the resource buffer requirements. We had started drafting this prior to the resource buffer stuff being drafted, and it sort of went in parallel for a while, so we just want to make sure it's clear that that's in there. And that's really the extent of the presentation. I know you've got a fairly lengthy ordinance that you might review. Just to give you an idea, this was one that was done. This is Eden Hill up in Dover, and they call it their traditional neighborhood design residential district, but it includes a large professional office building, a commercial district for medical and retail sections, and also residential. It had the general overall master plan and their what they called a pattern book, and it went through, and the economy hit it a little bit, but this gives you an idea of what their manual looked like. So it sort of spells out how they're going to do it, what they're going to do, what the buildings are going to look like. But it is moving along quite well. This is sort of just an overhead view. You can see that there's that doctor's office in here. There's internal streets that connect with traffic circles to two roads. There's residential over here. All of this ultimately is going to be developed. And I think this is actually a little bit outdated at this stage. This photograph. So that concludes it.
What was the name of that?
I'm sorry. It's Eden Hill.
Eden Hill.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just in case
It's a really nice place.
Yeah, it is pretty nice. And again, it was an opportunity for Dover to look at all these different things versus doing a zoning and site plan for just a medical building and a zoning and site plan for townhouses and a zoning and site plan for other types of retail types uses. So we hope it's a tool that the development community will use when appropriate. It's not something that's going to be used all the time. We don't expect it to. It's something that I think frankly, there probably are limited circumstances where it could be used based on whether there's infrastructure around, the size of the parcels still. But I think there's enough large areas of land that can be consolidated or whatever to make this work and end up with a better product for Sussex County and its residents now and in the future if it's done right. So I know there was a letter that Mr. Whitehouse submitted from Pannoni. They had some comments on it. I suppose Mr. Hutt's going to have some comments since he's sat through this. Take some time to consider it. Mr. Whitehouse, you've been through this whole process. I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
It's a good summary. Throughout the whole process, we've had technical input from the state. The PLUS comments are in as well. The state was very supportive of the objective, and they had some helpful comments too. So this has been through PLUS too.
Right. So we hope that eventually you'll act favorably upon it, so we can get it up to council, and hopefully they will.
Quick question. I may have missed this because I stepped out for a minute, but are we taking advantage of the opportunity to insert requirements around, protecting some forested space as part of these developments? Is there room for that in these requirements?
Yeah, so it states in here, and it's something you could consider bumping up. If you look at, and I don't expect you to read it now, but if you want to jot down line 235, it's on page 7. It talks about design principles, and I wasn't going to read you the whole ordinance.
No, please.
Be here until tomorrow, but Yeah, and it talks about the design for the entire zone. I'm going to read this part because I think it answers Scott's question. The design for the entire zone shall follow an environmentally sustainable approach to the development. To accomplish this, the design shall take advantage of natural drainage patterns on the site and minimize unnecessary earth-moving, erosion, tree clearance, and other disruption of the natural environment. Existing vegetation and habitat shall be preserved wherever possible. Wherever extensive natural tree cover and vegetation do not exist or cannot be preserved on the site, landscaping shall be undertaken in order to enhance the appearance of the development, et cetera. So a couple thoughts on that, it occurs to me. One is that's the directives of this. The second thing is you all have the opportunity to put conditions on it or require changes to the site plan. The third thing is that because this goes up to 12 units an acre, there's some give and take on that. So if you have a subdivision and you have 2 units an acre and that's what you're locked into, it becomes much more difficult without incentives to do tree preservation if you have a wooded lot. Here, if there's existing areas that are treed, you can work around those and still get a fairly high density, elsewhere on the project, or more intensive uses, through commercial or whatever you want to do. So I kind of think this actually fosters that more than any other, maybe an RPC, but I think this fosters that more than any other tool we have right now. The other thing with the RPCs is, again, for your benefit on the whole commission, with that, you're still stuck with the base zoning. You get design flexibility, but if it's MR, you're still stuck with 4 units an acre. I shouldn't say stuck. You're limited to 4 units an acre, Here, you get up to 12, but you've got to design it to take that into account. We're not expecting it to be 12 units an acre across 200 acres, but and that's what the design principles in here are intended to limit. But we're also, you're not beholden to the 4 units an acre that you would be in an RPC that's an MRPC. That was a long answer to your short question.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Yeah.
Covered it very well.
Okay, anything else for Vince?
I don't expect a motion on this tonight.
Well, we're going to see if there's any interest from the public to speak, and then we'll.
And I would say, too, I know Mr. Hutt's going to speak, it might be one of those circumstances where, this is a 17-page, 592-line ordinance. It might be something, I don't know, Mr. Whitehouse, when's it on for county council? November. So we have some time. Well, he's looking that up. It might be such a thing. October 17th. All right. I mean, you could leave the record open for a couple weeks anyway for anybody to submit written comments on it, since now it's actually, sort of seen the light of day and had a hearing. Just a suggestion, anyway.
Great idea.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone here with an interest in